Hello, this is an interview for Cast in Stone, and it's an interview with myself, Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, and I'm joined by, would you please introduce yourself and state for the camera your profession?
Yeah, Dr. Edson Burton, writer, historian, programmer, curator.
Wonderful. Dr. Burton, thank you for joining us today. Um, The purpose of the interview is to think through together the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston in
Mm.
Bristol. Um, Please tell me how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston. What brought it to your attention?
So I've been in Bristol since 1994, and I was studying a PhD in the Church of England and Church of England race relations. But then also began teaching a course on Black Bristol and Bristol and the transatlantic slave trade. That was a course that was delivered by Madge Dresser, and I was doing some teaching on that course, and it varied from year to year. But partly through the course, I became aware of Bristol's history and the conversations on the slave trade. But also over time, I became quite closely involved with Bristol's Black community. And I guess in a sense, I was not really, I was living in between a university life and a third sector art sector, and then also working with the heritage sectors in different ways, because I guess there wasn't that many of us in the city at the time who were interested in these themes of Bristol heritage, slavery, legacy. Although on the other hand, there was an activist community, but I would think it's fair to say that the activists were divided between those who are looking at a more Pan-Africanist vision and those who are much more sort of locally focused around Bristol and its slavery legacies.
Mhm.
So I sort of became aware of Colston and the Colston story through that initially, and some of the earliest activism around Colston. Um, that was, I think, it was Paul Stevenson, to be honest, and then it was much later that the Cleo Lake and others created the Counter and Colston group. But there have been conversations around Colston that had been happening beforehand. But I would say that they were much. Colston became a crystallizer, and it wasn't initially, it was more the umbrage that came about after the Festival of the Sea in 1998, where
Mhm.
Bristol didn't celebrate its, didn't commemorate the transatlantic slave trade. So it had this huge maritime festival with a glaring omission, and that I think led to, I think, a kind of coming together of heritage sector, key work in the heritage sector, feeling pressured. I would say we imagine all these constituencies as existing along a spectrum. So there
Mhm.
were people like Sue Giles who were always quite receptive to community engagement and also community voices, but perhaps not feeling that they were very much supported in that.
Mhm.
So I think the energy that came through activists, black and white, many left-wing socialists, among with members of the black community on a wider and shared spectrum, that created, I think, the kind of energy that led to a revisiting of Bristol's transatlantic slavery story, in which Colston eventually became the key focal point.
Mm. And when did that revisiting happen? You mentioned 1998 as a key year, and the work of perhaps Paul Stevenson before that, and of the group. Um, did you mean Countering Colston after that?
Yeah, countering
Mhm.
Colston, 90s, I would say Batch Dresser particularly key, Anya Summers, and others within the regional history group. But yeah, I think the difference with Madge as well is that she was, before widening participation was a thing, was actually quite connected to Black historical studies, and also researching the transatlantic slave trade. So I'd come to Bristol in '94, and I was aware of some concerns within the Black community at Kumba, where I was particularly satelliting and working and so on. But I think in those early '90s, it really shifted. The 1998 really shifted things a gear with the Festival of the Sea that I think pulled together. And Tony Forbes, the illustrator who did a work called Soul Down the River, which is a sort of a visual collage of Colston statue, merchant venturers, Bristol Bridge, suggesting that there was a kind of nexus of power. And that, in a sense, actually, I think that was 90, I think Tony's work was 1998 as well. That, again, I think, actually, in a kind of a visual way, also sort of cemented this attention on Colston that grew. I think then it was people like Ros Martin, Cleo Lake, who became very much aware. In fact, no, I would say that actually some of the early Jenda Serwa, Pan-Africanist, they were also involved in 2007 with the commemoration. Yes. Sorry, Nathaniel. There are so many different players at stake, so let me not try to be so clear on dating. I would say that there was Cleo would have been, I think, quite responsible for the actions around the school. So it became to light that in many ways Colston was still being honoured in the school with services, and also being honoured at a cathedral service. So Colston became kind of contested, really, in the early 2000s, and by, I think, which led to the protests led by Catherine Colston, that was about these Colston services and the picketing outside the school, picketing around school around the continuation of these services. And I think in many ways it sort of, people seem to be surprised. I guess in a way there is an element in Bristol in which the civic powers are invisible to many community people. The wider population, I don't think, is fully aware of just how significant and layered the roles of the old established organizations go. And in a sense, they had been honoring Colston in an untroubled way, I think, really until the early 2000s. And it wasn't as if there weren't voices that were raised, but it was the volume, and it was also the level of isolation of those voices. I mean, it's fair to say that there's probably a mischievous press that likes to report things and not necessarily in favor of activists, but also loony lefties, kind of thing. But nonetheless, it did lead to an energy that meant people suddenly had to think about Colston, think about this previously uncontested great son of Bristol.
And who does this statue represent? What did this person do in history? And how did you personally learn about that?
So I learnt about. So there are several ways in which Colston came on my radar. Oh gosh, one way in the early 2000s was that I was involved in slavery trails around the city, Bristol and its slaving heritage. I organized one with a group of activists in 2003. But Madge Dresser used to, and Coletta Jordan, and there's one other activist that was part of that. They created the Bristol and the Transatlantic Slave Trade Trail, which looked at various sites that were associated with the transatlantic slave trade. I think because quite importantly, people in Bristol, there was a strong folklore around the transatlantic slave trade, but there wasn't what we might call, historically researched information. So the, the, the even until today, you would still hear people say that there were slaves that were kept in caves, that there was a large population in Bristol. And in a sense, what the trail, among other efforts, were the kind of growing energy around researching the enslaved and the legacies, what it tried to do, I guess, was to put some of this public interest on a more solid footing, but also, I guess, in a way, it kind of had the impact of making it more real and more immediate. So whether I think people meant to politicize politicize their research, but inevitably, I think by taking it from the abstract folklore into actually the beneficiaries are here, that it's not something in the Caribbean, but we can see the wealth that's been generated across the architecture. So I inherited working on the trail with Madge Dresser, from Madge Dresser, I would say, and Coletta, as in there were a few occasions where I was asked to step in for Madge, and that meant reading up around the trail, and then gradually leading quite regularly, at times, cohorts of people around Bristol to visit these sites, including the Colston site. The other way in which I became aware of Colston was through.
This was between 2003 and.
I say 2004 onwards.
Okay.
But certainly by 2004 onwards. And then increasingly after 2007, where I think there was even more interest that accrued. But also, I think through the exhibitions, the 1999 exhibition at the City Museum, which was the first exhibition that focused on Bristol and the transatlantic slave trade. This is where I guess many of us became more aware of Colston, amongst other narratives around the transatlantic slave trade. And then Colston became part of the conversation in my teaching, first at UWE and then latterly at Bristol University, where I do a short course on Bristol and transatlantic slave trade. I guess in a sense, I've been fascinated by Colston, but also have been wary of what I was concerned that from my awareness of just how embedded wealth that was created by the transatlantic slave trade was in the city, that there could be an easy win for those who would want to avoid scrutiny by having all the attention focused on Colston. So that, for example, Corn Street and the Corn Exchange there, some of the places that were built along there, Venturous House, which is still on the corner of Queen Square. Queen Square itself, with the statue of William III and Nathaniel Day. That there were various sites, and just all across Bristol, Daubney Street, and There
Nathaniel
was
Day is in Queen Square, did you say?
yeah.
Okay. And
Alderman.
there is a statue in, I guess, in close proximity to that of Edward Colston. What's the
Mm.
relationship between the statue of Edward Colston and the nearby statue of Edmund Burke, or what, independently of the statue of Edward Colston, is the contestability of the statue of Edmund Burke?
I haven't really come across much attention paid to Burke, apart from those who are a little bit more concerned with the scholarship.
Mm.
And it's fascinating in a sense that his fluctuating stance on abolition has almost escaped much public attention, at least as I'm aware, and I may not be the most aware. Someone who, on the one hand, a champion of liberty and early sentiments around abolition, and then to sort of retreat from those. But it hasn't really entered the discourse as much, and I guess in a sense that kind of plays into my concern that I think the real momentum and energy can be focused around Colston, whereas I don't think many of the activists. I think he was the lightning rod to bring up different conversations. I'm not sure whether or not that has proved to be the case when 10,000 people involved in the toppling of the statue, or at least in the BLM march, actually, which it happened.
So you mentioned the BLM, Black Lives Matter march or protest, during which the statue was toppled. What specifically Black voices have been or had been raised in contestation of the statue? And what had those Black voices said?
So the Black voices, I would say, countering Colston, which was a black and white led group, but certainly Cleo Lake, Councillor Cleo Lake, Bristol Civic Mayor, was critical to that group. So was Ros Martin. And they were keen to expose, I think, the role of Colston in the transatlantic slave trade. And therefore, they wanted I think it's right in saying that they certainly wanted the services commemorating Colston suspended. I'm not sure if they asked for the statue to be removed, but definitely they created a new energy around Colston that was much more concerted than, say, the sporadic activism that happened across the city. Some of it guerrilla art, and I'm not always sure, apart from who by, although certainly I think Lawrence Hugh was involved in a couple of acts of visual activism across the city that either not so much on the site of the statue, but elsewhere as well. So myself and others had supported Madge in terms of this campaign that was internally within City Council to have the plaque, which would have been to contextualize Colston. So as I understand it, what happened with the BLM march, and there were two BLM marches, one in 2015 and one later one, of course, in 2020. The young people who led that march, there were 3 Black women supported by 2 white peers. So a small group of young people, students, who had created that rally, called on it, and then organized and so on. So ostensibly, because I was in correspondence with them when they were planning the march, because initially people thought that the march had something to do with the 2015 version, which myself, Cleo, and 3 others, including Nayo Anya, had been involved in. I was contacted by and then got in touch with the young people who were doing the march. It was in the middle of COVID, so I just was kind of checking as to what was the thinking, cautions and precautions and so on. But what happened is that the march was ostensibly about George Floyd, and the crowd split almost into two, with the main body leading towards Castle Park in Bristol, which is just about a mile away from College Green, where everyone gathered for the start of the march. And it was really this sort of middle body of people who were on that march, who then, and I was present when we saw the toppling, and the first people who stood on that platform were Black voices, Solomon Obi and Wishmaster, poets, performers, and I think there's one other person. Now, I, at the time, thought that, powerful as the moment was, that there was an element to which the agency of white activists in pulling down the march had kind of gained all the eyes, when in fact the march in itself was quite a radical moment in Bristol, in that it was, to my memory, and from what I know from research, probably the most significant march, larger than bus boycott, that was in support of a cause involving people of African heritage. And to think it was led by 3 Black young women, I thought, yeah, this was again something of a historical consequence, certainly in the history of our city. However, I have discovered that I think that there was more communication between the organizers of the march and the people who had planned to remove the statue. I don't think they'd planned it together, but there was some communication.
Okay.
So in a sense, I guess, sorry, I'm not sure how well I've answered your question, but there was, I think, the critical agency of people like Paul Stevenson, Cleo Lake, Ros Martin, Lawrence, were key to the activist energy around Colston, the actual picketing, the actual how would you say, the nobbling of councils, authorities, schools. I guess myself and others might say that we had a more behind the scenes role, more kind of academic role. Let's say academic role, but so sitting in different camps between culture and community heritage, and finding spaces to be heard in those. And that's not to say, of course, like people like the Bristol Radical History Group, Roger Ball, these were the white activists that were also involved in the countering Colston and the wider recognition of the transatlantic slave trade in Bristol.
Now, thank you for this very careful and as comprehensive as you can make it map of the various voices and groups of voices contesting the statue. When did this question of the statue's future in public space arise in your city for the authorities, for the council? And where did the request for consultation and a commission come from?
So, yes, it's a good question, because I sit on the commission. I haven't been its most active member, I should say. But that's some kind of disclaimer. I don't know.
Why is that?
If I'll answer, and hopefully that will give you that. If I answer the first question, and hopefully that will contain some of the response. So the statue was so after the statue was thrown into the river, I was aware that our mayor, Marvin Rees, was concerned that there may be a right-wing backlash, and also there may be calls to reinstall the statue. So there was, I think, the sense was that how could we manage this story of the statue's removal in such a way that it would build consent? Because it felt initially, after the statue had come down, there was a counter demonstration. And this is, I guess, in the context of the febrile atmosphere of 2020, there was counter demonstrations by those who are kind of sort of a wide constituency block of far-right members, some perhaps masquerading as others in less innocuous guises, far-right members, people who are sort of British nationalists, small and big N, war veterans, who thought that everything was up for attack. I don't think they fully, some were just being absolutely pernicious, and I think there was some genuine confusion as to what BLM stood for, and also what the critique of empire and heritage stood for. But that, and there was the attack on the grave of Scipio Africanus, and that happened in, I think, the week or two after the toppling of the Colston statue. So there was a concern that this may explode into the kind of cause that the far right were looking for. And certainly I think what the mayor was concerned with was to see if there was a way in which you could build a consensus, cool tempers, and manage the process of what to do with the statue. So, so the History Commission was created initially, actually, not to, partly to consider what to do with the statue, to manage the consultation process with the Bristol public, but to have a wider remit around contested histories in Bristol. And certainly what some of us felt who were on the committee is that Bristolians had been led to believe, not led to believe, but that there'd been a hijacking of other stories. There are other stories available to Bristolians. So, you know, they talk about the those who, I don't want to say the left behinds, because that's a whole different discourse that isn't, and it means it can be cultural rather than economic. But put it in a different way. Rather than people being gamed who were outside of these discourses, there was, I think, an interest in how could we talk about the city's heritage and its histories, including its working class histories, that in many ways had been so suppressed that people, I think, had been looking at Colston as the marker of Bristol identity. And actually that had kind of means in some ways that rather than the sort of looking at the elite classes, what about the Chartists and the other sort of radical groups that were in Bristol that are never given the same sort of airplay. So Nash Dressel was invited to join, Sean Sobers, Tim Cole, who was part of a group that I was already a member of. So I knew some of those involved. And then I was asked, and some of those on the committee felt that I should be involved. And I thought that I could be of some use, especially as I'd been involved in some of these discussions for a long time. And So I sat on the History Commission, and we basically supported the heritage teams at the City Museum with what was decided to be around what to do with the statue, but also a temporary display of the statue. Now, yeah, I think in some ways that the management of the consultation was a really powerful exercise and quite insightful. I wasn't sure that the energy for a wider coming together and understanding of Bristol and its histories, this way of creating a new narrative in which Black stories would be included alongside working class stories, to stop this kind of diverting, this gaming of people on the right. I wasn't sure that the energy was there for that actually long-term legacy, and I was disappointed that certainly the funding wasn't there. And I just felt that for what we wanted to do, what I thought we should be doing beyond the statue, it needed resourcing in a way that I didn't see available. And this is at the time. So I mean, in some ways, I feel that the committee was in good hands for what it was doing. I also had other things on, but also I felt especially that I needed to kind of think, where were my energies best placed? And I think for me, my concern was always around shifting the wider legacy discourse. I think in some ways, as someone, and I lived in South Bristol for a long time, 10 years when I first came to Bristol. And one of the things, and also actually through that, but partly through Kumba, I worked at the African Caribbean Arts Centre for 8 years while I was doing my PhD, and for a bit, while I was doing my PhD actually. And it meant that I was exposed to very different perspectives outside academia and outside activism, and just felt that on the whole, most Bristolians have very little forums to engage meaningfully in these questions of the city's identity. So there is a distorted there is a defensiveness that can arise among white populations, but also sometimes an ahistoricity among some of my Black peers and friends as well. And I guess how do we own in a really significant way a project to reinvent a city's identity? I think that was my concern, and I didn't, and I think that still is the priority. And while I think, Colston was an incredibly significant moment in that and has changed conversations in some ways, I think I've seen peaks and troughs of this, while actually the civic narrative hasn't changed significantly. And some of this really is to do with resources. Decolonizing curriculums, attempts at a Black curriculum. Sometimes they're conceptually not clear. What do we mean by that? Conceptually, what do we mean by a Black curriculum? Are we political Black? Are we African heritage? And it's important in terms of marshalling the resources to try and do a revised curriculum in a way that makes sense and includes multiple stories or not, but it just at least to kind of think this through. But the resources just aren't there. And I think that's my frustration.
I hear you. What what was the working methodology of the commission, and what do you take to have been your most significant contribution to the commission?
So our key points were to liaise between the cabinet office, the mayoral office, and the heritage sector, to work with the heritage sector on the consultation process. And what we would do is scrutinize the findings of both the consultations, but also to interrogate what questions were being asked, how they're being asked. There was a smaller group which outside the commission, which was a MSHED led initiatives around Black history, and that was quite useful for the commission, because I sat on both, to push back on some of the questions that we wanted to include. But the interrogation was quite useful in a sense, and just in terms of understanding how we were not going to, some of the pitfalls of the public consultation, avoiding, for example, the ability for people to, or differentiating between voices that were from outside Bristol, and so foregrounding and separating what Bristolians thought as opposed to what people in other parts of the city or other parts of the country might think, bearing in mind, Bristol, London are, Liverpool, probably quite special cases in terms of perspectives around decolonization and empire and civic identity. And then I think disseminating and considering ways in which to best disseminate the findings of the commission, and to work also with a legacy group. The legacy groups was in particular was a African diasporic group which were tasked with running the consultation as to what people wanted to do with the legacy, not the legacy of the statue, but with a wider record. How does Bristol honor the transatlantic slave trade or the enslavement of Africans? So my specific, sorry.
Oh, forgive me. Yes, you're specific.
Oh, yeah. So I think in some ways my specific contribution was an aliveness, I think, to an aliveness to how these different constituencies in Bristol I don't know how people think, but sometimes when you move between different spaces, it's helpful in terms of just thinking through how a question may or may not be received and land. It also, I think we had what I think for some members were surprising results with a significant number of people of African diasporic heritage who would have wanted the statue to have stayed in situ, and not for it to having it reinstalled, because that was taken off the questionnaire, but more. And I understood why from my experience of running the slavery trails. And there is a danger, I think, when you have a civic body, statutory bodies, working with communities, that they forget the plurality of the communities and plurality of perspectives within a community. And through the trails and through other means, I was aware that there's significant element of opinion which felt that actually the statue told us something around the history of Bristol, was a reminder of Bristol's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, that it was almost like the danger was of erasure, but erasure for what end? I guess I liken it to the body is missing, but the crime continues. So in a sense, how do you, and if the body is missing, can it look as if a perpetrator is gone, but actually we still live within the ramifications of it. We still live with the legacies of it. So I understood that perspective, and I think there were others on the commission who were surprised by it. But nonetheless, I think in reality, I would say that the Black community in Bristol, we don't actually have as many forums to robustly discuss these questions of contestation in a thorough way. So often opinions are represented by people with a particular ideological vision, and that includes myself, of course. But that actually some sort of internal conversation may reap dividends in modifying, changing, or challenging all of us. But and I think that's the danger, that sometimes working with white organizations and peers, that they accept the voice of what's in the room, and may be surprised when actually data-driven consultation presents a different story, a more complex one.
And what role did you play in analysing and evaluating that data, with specific respect to that part of the qualitative data that apparently was emanating from people racialized as Black? Did you have sight of those, and are they now in the public domain?
They are in the public domain. I would say that Sean and another member of the committee worked most closely with the heritage team on the data analysis, and they did most of the number crunching and presented us with the findings to support with the interpretation, and also what would be the wording of the final recommendations. So my role in that regard wasn't significant.
Now, you mentioned the legacy steering group. What was the difference between the legacy steering group and the We Are Bristol History Commission? What was their relationship with each other? And what was the relationship between the History Commission's final report and the final report of Project Truth?
So it's slightly frustrating for myself, because I think I was really concerned with legacy. I wondered, but we were encouraged actually not to, that they were very separate entities. And I think in some ways...
Who gave you that encouragement?
That would have come certainly from the Cabinet Office of Deputy Mayor, that and I think there was some sense of respecting. So looking at it differently, there was, I think, a way in which the management of the statue and the wider story was something in which largely academic voices were invited, and statutory voices were invited. Project Truth was seen as the consultation with the community as to what the legacy should be. And I think that was partly driven by an attempt to ensure that Black voices were most prominent and in charge of that conversation, whereas in past it hadn't always been clear that they were. And so for that reason, I think it was important that, of course, we could go along to Project Truth meetings and consultations, but that we weren't coming there with any particular sort of agency, and that certainly myself and Sean, as people of African heritage, would have been able to come along. But I guess in a sense, the problem for me there is it creates this unreal schism between between a legacy body and and Project Truth, and our reports and our workings were quite separate, and as seen as fulfilling different functions. And I suppose the problematic for those like myself who feel that actually we have something to contribute to what the legacy outcomes could be, and also just to give a different perspective on what the pragmatic workings out of some of those might be, and also to maybe know the difference between some of the rhetoric that might come from those who profess decolonization, and the likely outcomes. So in some ways, I did feel quite hamstrung by not feeling that I could partake in those conversations while understanding where that had come from. And and I think, ironically, the council's leadership on this discourse, which had predated the Colston statue, there was a two-edged sword to it. It was a blessing and a curse. I think that there were very different groups all saying that the transatlantic slave trade in Bristol need to be commemorated in some shape or form. I was involved in at least 2 or 3 different conversations with different groups, and some with potential finance. That's to some with potential finance, significant finance. And then there was a Pan-Africanist contingent who really didn't want to engage in what they saw was these white-led initiatives. And I think they, for me, were more they were not white-led. They were much more, and of course there are those initiatives that are white-led, but they were in some ways much more of a complex picture of people working together for a common aim, while also trying to ensure that Black agency is critical. So the council, I didn't feel, were sufficiently aware of the nuances actually within the Black activist, Black academic community to show the kind of leadership that could have got us round the table in a different way. I felt it was critically important that actually the academics and activists have space to converse safely. And to this day, I think, while people, I wouldn't say there's any Punch and Judy, but there is still an undefined, unclear area in which we sit around actually what we're trying to pragmatically achieve, where we land and where we sit. And at the same time, through its weight and agency, the council was able to focus minds. My question is to what end? Whether where will it lead to a significant legacy outcome? I'm not sure. Yeah.
I'm aware that we're at 17 minutes past 2, and I did promise to let you go at 15:15. I have one more question for you, and I'm going to invite you to ask me any questions that you might have before we close. We towards the beginning we talked about the Black Lives Matter protests, and that being one milestone that led to, for instance, the setting up of the commission. and the Black voices that may or may have not have been raised in that protest. To what extent do you think those Black voices, including in their variety, as you pointed out, to what extent do you think, especially through the work of the Commission, but not only, through the work of the Legacy Steering Group as well, and any other work, to what extent do you think Black voices in Bristol, raised in 2020 around the statue, have been heard or listened to?
We're I would say we are still in the echo to see where we land. I certainly felt that the subtextual demand for a recognition of the inequalities that face Black life moved from the equalities industry, moved from academia to a wider, much broader conversation about diversity and quality among organizations and bodies that hadn't seriously considered that beforehand. I would say that the interrogation of Bristol civic identity had shifted tremendously, and that more people are embraced by conversations about decolonization or empire in a critical way than had been even when the Empire and Commonwealth Museum was open, and then that closed in about 2010, 12. I think that and also at this particular point in time with a Black mayor and a Black deputy mayor, it's been a period in which some of these conversations have been fostered and supported. And the culture sector has responded in terms of looking at programming, inclusion, making steps forward in that regard. But given the plurality of Black voices and demands, I'm also conscious that there are concerns that were not, and there are existing concerns that haven't really been addressed and heard. For some people that I speak to, it is around resourcing, it is around crime and policing, but also and safety, young people's safety. There was a murder of a young person a few weeks ago, and one of the outcomes of that, one of the conversations that have come out about that is, people being annoyed, and it's what about we're talking about statues, and we're talking, so it's not everyone in the community sees the linkages between the kind of the psychic state that we're in a city which racializes Black lives and doesn't care for Black lives, and the violence, psychic and physical, which ensues. But because in a sense that linkage isn't always clear, isn't always made clear, then I think there are those who are dissatisfied with and don't feel heard by BLM, don't feel particularly enfranchised, and still feel, and that does, this conversation around inclusivity reach a particular cohort, but not everyone. And in actual fact, the economic challenges, political challenges, keep many people disenfranchised. I would say that my fear, again, is that without a thorough, robust investigation. And one of the, prior to the statue toppling, there was a shift towards, away from, or what do we do to commemorate transatlantic slave trade, to looking at structural inequality. And this is even by people who describe as small L liberal thinkers, recognizing that actually where they have resource, that resource could look at those issues, support, empower, lose power. There is and in some ways I'm not I don't think that has, with the cost of living crisis, we're sometimes the first hostages to fortune, and I wonder whether this more structural concern for inclusion and diversity has become quieter. And it seems to be about policy practices rather than how do we change root and branch in the structure of our societies to allow the realization of Black possibilities for those who aren't already close to the table, if not at the table. I guess as well that in terms of power shifting, there is, I'm losing power as a way of, and I suppose that's what we kind of need from universities, from the heritage sector, even, from culture teams and so on, is what is the roadmap for significant Black leadership to change the agendas. And while inclusivity, and I've seen real strides, and I've been in Bristol, the power dynamics I don't think have shifted significantly. There are gestures, but how solid and significant are they? The power dynamics remain the same, and I think the money bottom line still seems to dominate.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Edson Burton, for sharing with me your perspective on the statue of Edward Colston. Are there any final comments that you'd like to make, or any questions that you'd like to ask me?
No. Thank you for the opportunity to reflect. It's a difficult, because there are so many. It's such a long story, and the statue kind of crystallizes what I call really Britain's identity crisis. We're not in a culture war. I think we're in the country suffers from still the hang-ups with an identity that it thinks it needs and struggles to lose. And I thought there was a possibility for something, for the reinvention, the curation of a new identity, one that doesn't require the great in Britain, one that's more humble and listening, filled with possibility. But I think we've made some strides, but I still think we're far off that. Nathaniel, I'm going to have to get going.
This has been inspirational. Thank you, Edson. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.